In her sophomore year of college, Lena Carter thought she had everything figured out. She had Ryan, a boy with a confident smile and dreams as big as the city skyline. He made life feel electric, as if the future was theirs to shape, as if love was enough to hold everything together. To 21-year-old Lena, he wasn't just her boyfriend. He was the plan. After late-night study sessions, they'd sit on the dorm rooftop, legs dangling over the edge, whispering about what was next. New York. A tiny apartment with a leaky faucet. Jobs that barely paid the bills but kept the dream alive. Maybe even a business of their own one day. She could picture it all, a life built side by side, something unstoppable. She was sure their love was forever. But forever had an expiration date. It started small. Ryan, who once answered every text within minutes, suddenly took hours. Their late-night talks grew shorter. He canceled plans, brushed off questions. "I have to focus, Lena. This is my shot, Georgetown, maybe Stanford. I can't afford distractions." He said it like it was just a fact. Like they hadn't spent years planning together. Lena told herself it was just stress. Just a phase. But deep down, she knew. The future she had imagined was slipping through her fingers like sand, no matter how hard she tried to hold on. And then, one crisp October afternoon, it all fell apart. They were walking down the tree-lined campus path when Ryan suddenly stopped. Hands in his pockets. Jaw tight. "Lena, we need to talk." Her stomach twisted. She forced a smile. "Okay, what's up?" He kicked at a stray pebble, eyes on the ground. Us. It doesn't fit anymore." She blinked. "Didn't fit?" "Look," he exhaled, still not meeting her gaze. "I have plans. Big ones. And this," he waved vaguely between them, "it's holding me back." Holding him back. The words cut like glass. "I thought we were in this together," she whispered. Ryan finally looked at her, but his hazel eyes were distant. Resolved. "I've made up my mind, Lena. It's better this way." Just like that, it was over. No fight. No second thoughts. Just, done. She stood frozen as he walked away, his silhouette shrinking into the distance. He never looked back. Not once. The autumn wind picked up, rustling golden leaves around her. But she barely noticed. Her chest ached, a hollow kind of hurt that spread until it swallowed her whole. How could he toss away everything they had built together like it was nothing more than an old notebook, a dream that no longer mattered? She stood there for a long time. Long after his footsteps had faded. The days blurred together. The pain dulled, but it never truly left. And then, the nausea started. The exhaustion. The missed periods. She blamed it on stress. On heartbreak. But deep down, she already knew. One cold morning, she slipped into a corner drugstore, bought a test, and locked herself in her apartment bathroom. She sat on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, heart pounding as the seconds crawled by. Then, 2 pink lines appeared. Bright. Unmistakable. It felt like the world had stopped spinning. Lena Carter was pregnant. And Ryan was gone. The pregnancy test burned in Lena's pocket like a loaded gun. She could still hear her mother's voice calling her to dinner, warm and oblivious. Her hands trembled as she stepped into the dining room. The familiar smell of home-cooked meatloaf filled the air, but her stomach twisted. Her father sat at the head of the table, glasses perched on the edge of his nose as he skimmed the evening newspaper. Her mother bustled around, setting dishes down with practiced ease. Everything was normal. Everything was about to change. Lena hovered by her chair, her heart pounding so hard she thought they might hear it. "Mom. Dad." Her voice came out thinner than she intended. Her father looked up, brow furrowed. "What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." Her mother paused mid-scoop, a serving spoon dripping gravy onto the plate. Lena clenched her fists to stop them from shaking. I need to tell you something. Silence. Her parents exchanged a glance. Okay, her mother said cautiously. Go ahead. Lena swallowed hard, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. I'm pregnant. The room froze. The spoon slipped from her mother's hand, clattering onto the table with a sharp clang. Her father's face went blank, as if his brain refused to process what she had just said. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, pregnant? Her mother finally gasped, voice barely above a whisper. No, no, that can't be. Her father's chair scraped against the floor as he pushed back, standing slowly. Tell me you're joking, Lena, he said, his voice eerily calm. She held her ground, even as fear coiled in her stomach. I'm not. His jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Her mother clutched the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping her upright. How could you be so reckless? So stupid? I didn't plan for this to happen. Lena shot back, her voice cracking. But it did, and I have to deal with it. Her father exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. For a moment, just a brief moment, he looked torn. Like there was a part of him that wanted to reach out. To soften. But then, his face hardened. No. His voice was like steel. You don't get to stand here and tell us this like it's nothing. You've thrown away your future, Lena. Our future. What will people say? The church? The neighbors? Lena's chest tightened. I don't care what they say. Well, I do, he snapped, slamming his fist onto the table. The dishes rattled, her mother flinched, and Lena's stomach lurched. Her father pointed a shaking finger at her. You are not raising a child under my roof. Lena's breath hitched. Dad, please. You think you can handle this? He cut her off, his voice rising. You're 21, Lena. You don't even have a real job. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Her mother wiped at her eyes, shaking her head. Paul, maybe we should just. No, Ellen. His voice was firm, unwavering. He turned back to Lena, eyes cold. If you're old enough to make this choice, you're old enough to deal with the consequences. If you want to keep this baby, do it somewhere else. The words knocked the air from her lungs. You're kicking me out, she choked. I'm telling you to take responsibility, he said, his jaw set. Her mother reached for him. Paul, please. She made her decision, he snapped. Now she has to live with it. Lena felt the ground beneath her crack. Her own father. The man who had carried her on his shoulders when she was little, who had cheered at her art shows, who had once promised that no matter what, she'd always have a home. Now, he was looking at her like she was a stranger. Like she was a mistake. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away. Upstairs, she grabbed a duffel bag and shoved in whatever she could, clothes, a pair of sneakers, the old sketchbook where she had planned out her dream life with Ryan. A life that no longer existed. Her hands trembled as she zipped the bag shut. This was real. She had nowhere to go. No home. No plan. Just a baby growing inside her and a future that felt like it had shattered into a million pieces. She yanked open her nightstand drawer and grabbed her phone. There was only one person left who might take her in. Her grandmother. She scrolled through her contacts with shaky fingers, pressing call the moment she found the name. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice crackled through the speaker. Lena? It's late. What's wrong? Her resolve broke. A sob tore from her throat. Grandma, I have nowhere to go. Can I? Her voice hitched. Can I come stay with you? A beat of silence. Then, firm and unwavering. Of course, you can, baby. Come home. Lena clutched the phone tighter, sucking in a shaky breath. She wasn't sure what home meant anymore. But maybe, just maybe, she was about to find out. Lena gripped the cold metal railing of the bus station bench, pulling her coat tighter around her. The night air bit at her skin, but it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. She had nowhere to go. Her father's voice still echoed in her mind, sharp and final. If you're old enough to make this choice, you're old enough to deal with the consequences. She swallowed the lump in her throat and glanced down at her phone. The call had ended minutes ago, but she still clung to the only words that had offered her any comfort. Of course, you can, baby. Come home. Home. She wasn't even sure what that meant anymore. The bus finally pulled up, its headlights cutting through the darkness. She hoisted her duffel bag over her shoulder and stepped on, avoiding the driver's gaze as she dropped a few crumpled bills into the fare box. She took a seat near the back, pressing her forehead against the cool window as the city lights blurred past. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known. Her parents. Her school. The life she had built. And yet, despite the fear twisting inside her, there was something else. A flicker of something small, something fragile. Hope. 2 hours later, the Greyhound bus pulled into a tiny station on the outskirts of a town Lena hadn't visited in years. Springfield. Her grandmother's house was just a few blocks away, but exhaustion made the distance feel impossible. She adjusted the strap of her bag and started walking, her steps slow, deliberate. The streets were quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath her shoes. By the time she reached the small brick house at the end of the street, the porch light was already on. The front door creaked open before she could knock. And there she was, Margaret Carter. Her grandmother stood in the doorway, wrapped in a thick cardigan, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun. She didn't ask questions. She didn't scold or hesitate. She just opened her arms. Lena barely made it up the steps before she collapsed into them, the weight of everything finally crashing down. Margaret held her tightly, one hand smoothing over her hair. "It's okay, baby," she murmured. "You're safe now." For the first time that night, Lena believed it. The next morning, she woke up to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a brief second, she almost forgot where she was. Then reality settled in. She wasn't in her childhood bedroom. She wasn't in college. She was in her grandmother's guest room, wrapped in a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender. And she was pregnant. Lena swallowed hard and forced herself out of bed. She found Margaret in the kitchen, humming to an old radio as she flipped pancakes. "Morning, sweetheart," her grandmother greeted without turning around. Lena hesitated in the doorway. "Morning." Margaret glanced over her shoulder, eyes scanning her carefully. "You get any sleep?" "A little." She nodded, setting a plate in front of her. "Eat." Lena stared at the food. She wasn't hungry. But she also knew better than to argue. She took a bite, chewing slowly. "So," Margaret said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "You gonna tell me what happened, or are we gonna dance around it?" Lena's grip tightened on her fork. Margaret didn't push. She simply sipped her coffee, waiting. Finally, Lena exhaled. "I told them. My parents." Margaret nodded knowingly. "Didn't take it well, did they?" Lena let out a dry laugh. "That's an understatement." Margaret set down her mug and folded her hands on the table. "Do you want to go back?" The question caught Lena off guard. "What?" "Your parents," Margaret said. "Do you want to fix things with them? Try to make it work?" Lena looked down at her plate. She wanted to say yes. But she knew the truth. "No," she whispered. Margaret nodded again, like she had expected that answer. "Then we move forward." Lena blinked at her. "Just like that?" "Just like that." For the first time in weeks, Lena felt like she could breathe. The next few days blurred together. Margaret took her to a small clinic in town, where a kind nurse confirmed what Lena already knew: she was about 12 weeks pregnant. The realization hit hard. It was no longer just an idea, an abstract thought. It was real. There was a heartbeat. A life growing inside her. And for the first time, instead of feeling terrified, she felt something else. Determination. She didn't know how she was going to do this. But she knew one thing for sure. She was going to do it. No matter what it took. Lena had always known survival was about adapting. She had spent weeks adjusting to her new reality, living with her grandmother, preparing for a future she never planned for. But no one had warned her how exhausting it would be. Morning sickness hit like clockwork. The nausea, the headaches, the dizziness. She tried not to complain, but Margaret saw right through her. "You need rest, baby," her grandmother would say, watching as Lena stubbornly tried to push through another wave of exhaustion. But rest wasn't an option. Not when money was running low. Not when she needed a job, fast. That's how she found herself standing outside Joe's diner, a faded help-wanted sign taped to the window. The inside smelled of coffee and grease, the kind of scent that clung to your clothes long after you left. The place was old, the floors slightly sticky, the booths worn from years of customers coming and going. Behind the counter, a man in his late 20s leaned against the register, flipping through a ledger. Ethan Walker. Lena had heard his name around town. Some said he was a businessman, a numbers guy. Others said he was trouble. Right now, she just hoped he was willing to hire a pregnant woman with no waitressing experience. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. Ethan barely glanced up. "We're not open yet." "I'm not here to eat." She hesitated, then added, "I saw the sign." Now he looked up. Sharp blue eyes, slightly raised brow. "You want the job?" Lena nodded. Ethan gave her a once-over, taking in her oversized coat, the way she clutched her bag like it was the only thing keeping her steady. His gaze flicked briefly to her stomach, then back to her face. "You ever worked in a diner before?" "No. But I learn fast." "That so?" He set the ledger down, crossing his arms. "Why do you want the job?" She hesitated, but only for a second. "Because I need it." For a moment, she thought he was going to turn her away. Then, with a sigh, he grabbed a notepad from the counter and tossed it to her. "Fine. You start tomorrow. Don't break anything." Lena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I won't." Her first shift was brutal. She spilled coffee. Got orders mixed up. Almost dropped a tray of pancakes onto a trucker's lap. By the end of the night, her feet ached, her back throbbed, and she was sure Ethan was going to fire her. Instead, he handed her a paycheck and smirked. "You didn't run out crying." "That's something." She rolled her eyes, tucking the money into her pocket. "I told you. I learn fast." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "We'll see." Days turned into weeks. Lena got better. Faster. Stronger. The nausea didn't disappear, but she learned to work through it. She memorized the regulars' orders, mastered balancing plates on her arm, and even figured out how to handle Ethan's occasional mood swings. He was a tough boss, blunt, impatient, and allergic to small talk. But he was fair. And, whether he admitted it or not, he was watching out for her. When she nearly fainted during a lunch rush, he shoved a stool toward her. "Sit. Now." When she mentioned needing extra shifts, her name mysteriously appeared on the schedule more often. And when she hesitated to cash her first big paycheck, worried about saving every cent, Ethan simply said, "Money's no good if you're too exhausted to spend it. Buy yourself something decent to eat." He never asked about the baby. Never pried into her past. But in his own way, he showed up. And after everything Lena had lost, that meant something. It meant everything. Lena had expected many things when she started working at Joe's diner. Exhaustion. Long hours. The occasional rude customer. What she hadn't expected was Ethan Walker becoming a problem. At first, things were fine. She kept her head down, worked hard, and ignored the fact that her boss was both infuriatingly blunt and annoyingly perceptive. But then, things changed. And it all started with the money. "You're short again." Ethan's voice cut through the hum of the empty diner, low and unreadable. Lena stiffened, gripping the dish towel in her hands. She had stayed late to help close, wiping down the counters while Ethan went over the books. She turned to face him, heart sinking. "What?" He pushed a ledger toward her. "Your tips. You're not taking them." She swallowed hard. Damn it. She had hoped he wouldn't notice. Ethan leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. "Why?" Lena hesitated. "Because every extra dollar went straight into a battered envelope under her mattress. Because saving for a baby when you had no financial safety net meant making sacrifices." But she wasn't about to tell him that. "I just don't need them right now." Ethan arched a brow. "That's the dumbest thing I've heard all week." "Excuse me?" He scoffed, shaking his head. "You're pregnant. You work double shifts. And you're acting like you don't need money?" Lena clenched her jaw. "I didn't ask for your opinion, Ethan." "No, but you're getting it anyway." She turned away, busying herself with the rag in her hands, scrubbing at a spot on the counter that didn't exist. "You don't get it," she muttered. "Then explain it to me." Lena stilled. She hated this. Hated that he noticed things she didn't want noticed. She exhaled sharply, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Look, I appreciate the job. But what I do with my money is none of your business." Ethan studied her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. Then he shrugged. "Fine. Keep being stubborn. Just don't pass out on my shift." With that, he walked away, leaving Lena standing there, fists clenched. Why did he have to be right? Things only got worse from there. Ethan started watching her. Not in an obvious way, but in a way that made her feel exposed. When she struggled to lift heavy trays, he took them without a word. When she looked pale after a long shift, an extra meal mysteriously showed up on her break table. It was infuriating. Because it was help, and Lena didn't know how to accept help anymore. Then came the night everything changed. The diner was nearly empty, just a few late-night customers lingering over coffee. Lena was finishing up when the door swung open, and everything inside her froze. Ryan. He looked different. Older, maybe. But the moment their eyes met, the past crashed down on her like a wave. Lena's pulse thundered in her ears. "Hey, Lena." His voice was cautious, like he knew he had no right to be standing there. She gripped the edge of the counter, willing herself to stay calm. "What do you want?" Ryan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I heard about everything. About the baby. And I don't," she cut him off, voice tight. "You don't get to show up now." Ethan was watching from the back, his expression unreadable. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. "I just want to talk." Lena stared at him, stomach churning. "Talk?" she repeated bitterly. "Like how you talked when you walked away?" Ryan flinched. Lena shook her head. "You don't get to come back when it's convenient, Ryan." For a second, he looked like he might argue. But then, Ethan was suddenly beside her, his presence solid, unmoving. "You heard her," Ethan said, voice calm but firm. "She doesn't want you here." Ryan's gaze flicked between them. A beat of silence. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. Lena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She expected Ethan to say something. To ask. To push. But he didn't. Instead, he just leaned against the counter and said, "You okay?" Lena's throat tightened. She nodded. "Yeah." Ethan didn't call her a liar. He just handed her a glass of water and muttered, "Take a break, Carter." And for the first time in a long time, Lena let herself breathe. Lena had spent months building a new life, one where Ryan didn't exist and where she had full control over what came next. But the past had a way of creeping back in. And it started with the texts. At first, she ignored them. "Ryan, hey, can we talk?" "Ryan, Lena, please. Just once." "Ryan, I know you hate me, but I just want to explain." Each message made her chest tighten, her fingers hovering over the screen before she forced herself to swipe them away. She had nothing to say to him. Nothing to hear. Then the texts turned into calls. He never left voicemails, but the sight of his name lighting up her phone sent a wave of unease crawling under her skin. The worst part? She wasn't sure if he was actually sorry, or just trying to clear his conscience. Ethan noticed. Of course, he did. She wasn't exactly subtle, flinching every time her phone buzzed, gripping her apron a little too tight during shifts. One evening, after the last customer had left, Ethan leaned against the counter and nodded toward her phone. "Who keeps calling you?" Lena hesitated, then shoved it into her pocket. "No one important." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You look ready to throw it across the room." "That's not no one." She exhaled sharply, scrubbing at a spot on the counter. "It's Ryan." A pause. "Huh." Lena glanced up, expecting him to say something else, to push for details. But he just crossed his arms and asked, "You gonna call him back?" She swallowed. She didn't know. Finally, she muttered, "Probably not." Ethan nodded, like that was a perfectly acceptable answer. Then he handed her a glass of water and said, "Drink this before you pass out." And that was the end of it. No lectures. No prying. Just a simple question, one that left her thinking longer than she wanted to admit. A week later, another ghost from her past arrived. But this one came in an envelope. Lena found it tucked between the stack of diner mail, her name scrawled across the front in handwriting she hadn't seen in months. Her mother's. She stared at it for a long time, heart pounding. Then she shoved it into her pocket and went back to work. She thought she had hidden her reaction well. But later that night, as she wiped down tables, Ethan slid into the booth across from her and drummed his fingers on the tabletop. "So?" She didn't look up. "So? You gonna tell me what's in the letter, or am I supposed to guess?" Lena stiffened. "It's none of your business." "True," Ethan said easily. "But you've been cleaning that same table for 5 minutes, and I don't think the wood's gonna disappear if you scrub it hard enough." She sighed, dropping the rag. "It's from my mom," she admitted. Ethan nodded, waiting. But Lena didn't know what to say. She had spent months convincing herself that her parents had made their choice. And now, suddenly, they wanted to talk? Why now? Ethan tilted his head. "You gonna read it?" Lena hesitated. "I don't know." Another nod. Then, just like before, Ethan didn't push. He just leaned back and said, "Whatever you decide, don't do it just because you feel like you have to." Lena blinked. She expected him to tell her what to do. To say something blunt, something practical. But instead, he was just giving her a choice. She didn't know how to feel about that. That night, she sat in bed, staring at the unopened letter. She ran her fingers over the edge of the envelope, debating whether to rip it open or throw it away. In the end, she did neither. Instead, she tucked it into the drawer beside her bed. For now, the past could wait. Because the future? That was hers to decide. Lena had imagined this moment 100 times. She had pictured the confrontation, the anger, the pain. What she hadn't expected was hesitation. She stood at the front of Joe's diner, staring through the glass at the 2 figures outside. Her parents. They looked different. Older. Tired. Her mother clutched her purse like a lifeline, while her father shifted uncomfortably, his jaw set tight. They weren't storming in. They weren't demanding anything. But they were here. And for the first time in months, Lena wasn't sure what to do. You gonna let them in or make them stand out there all day? Ethan's voice was calm, but she could feel his eyes watching her. She swallowed hard. I don't know. Ethan nodded, as if that was a perfectly valid answer. Then don't. Lena turned to him, frowning. What? He shrugged. You don't owe them anything, Carter. You don't have to open that door just because they knocked. She studied him, searching for something in his expression, judgment, expectation, anything. But there was nothing. Just a quiet understanding. But if you do open it, Ethan added, make sure it's because you want to. Not because you feel like you have to. Lena exhaled slowly. Then, before she could overthink it, she moved toward the door and pulled it open. Her mother gasped softly, her eyes immediately scanning Lena, her face, her stomach, her life without them. Lena. Her voice was breathless. Hopeful. Lena crossed her arms. Why are you here? Her father cleared his throat, shifting his weight. We heard about everything. About you. The baby. And? Her mother stepped forward. Sweetheart, we just want to talk. Lena's stomach twisted. She wanted to believe them. But she also knew them. Talk? Her voice was sharp. Like how we talked when you told me to leave. When you said I wasn't your daughter anymore? Her mother winced. Her father's jaw tightened. Lena, that's not fair. She let out a hollow laugh. Not fair? Her father sighed. We were scared. You were too young. We didn't know what to do. Lena stared at him. So you kicked me out. Silence. Her mother looked down, tears welling in her eyes. We thought it was the only way to make you understand how serious this was, she whispered. It wasn't about punishing you, Lena, her father added. We didn't want you to ruin your life. Lena's chest tightened. Ruin my life. She said the words slowly, carefully, as if testing their weight. Her father shifted. You had such a bright future ahead of you. We didn't want you to throw it away. Lena felt something inside her snap. You think I threw my life away? She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. God, you still don't get it, do you? Her mother reached for her. Lena, please. No. She took a step back, her voice steadier now. You want to know what happened after you kicked me out? I built something. I found a way to survive, to take care of myself. I made a life, a good one. Without you. Her father looked away, guilt flickering across his face. Her mother was crying now, covering her mouth with her hands. We were wrong, she whispered, voice cracking. Lena, we were so wrong. Lena swallowed against the lump in her throat. It should have felt good to hear those words. It didn't. Because it didn't change anything. Across the diner, Ethan leaned against the counter, watching as Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee. You're not going to step in, she asked, raising an eyebrow. Ethan shook his head. Not my choice to make. Margaret hummed, stirring her coffee. You like her. Ethan huffed out a quiet laugh. Didn't say that. Margaret smirked. Didn't have to. They both turned back to the scene unfolding in the diner, Lena standing firm, her parents unraveling. You think she's gonna forgive them? Margaret asked. Ethan exhaled, thoughtful. I think, some people change. Some don't. But at the end of the day, only Lena gets to decide what's best for her. Margaret nodded approvingly. Smart man. Ethan just smirked. Don't tell Carter. She'll get cocky. Lena let the silence stretch between her and her parents, letting it settle, letting them feel the weight of what they had done. Then she spoke. I'm not ready to forgive you. Her father looked down. Her mother let out a choked sob. But. Lena inhaled slowly, choosing her next words carefully. I'm not closing the door completely. She didn't know what the future held. Maybe one day, she'd be ready to forgive. Maybe she wouldn't. But for now, this was enough. She nodded toward the exit. You should go. Her parents hesitated, then slowly turned and walked away. This time, Lena was the one watching them leave. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel abandoned. She felt free. The weeks that followed were strange, like stepping into unfamiliar territory where everything looked the same, but nothing felt quite right. Lena had let her parents back into her life, but she kept her guard up. Conversations were polite, careful, like walking on thin ice. They asked about her pregnancy, about the diner, about how she had managed all this time. But there was always an unspoken weight between them, the past, the pain, the years they had missed. Some nights, she lay awake wondering if she had made the right choice. Other nights, she wondered if she had made it too easy for them. And then there was Ethan. Their partnership at the diner had settled into a rhythm. He still showed up at odd hours, still challenged her with new business ideas, still had that infuriating way of making her rethink everything. But there was something else now, something neither of them spoke about. A quiet understanding. A lingering glance that lasted just a little too long. A hesitation when their hands brushed while exchanging paperwork. Lena didn't know what to do with it. She had spent so long building walls, surviving on her own, that the idea of letting someone in, really in, felt terrifying. But life, as she had learned, had a way of making choices for you. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. Lena was closing up the diner, wiping down the last few tables, when the door swung open. She turned, expecting a late-night customer. But it wasn't. It was Ryan. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Lena, he said, breathless, as if he had run here. She stiffened. What are you doing here? He hesitated, looking around the empty diner. I needed to see you. I needed to see him. Lena's stomach twisted. Him, she repeated, her voice low. The baby, Ryan said. Our son. Lena exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the counter. You don't get to call him that. Ryan flinched. Lena, I know I messed up. I was scared. I was young and stupid. But I've had time to think, and I want to be in his life. I need to be. She shook her head. You don't just get to walk back in and decide you care now. Where were you when I was working double shifts? When I was wondering how I was going to do this alone? I regret all of it, he said desperately. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. I want to fix this. Lena let out a bitter laugh. You all want to fix things now, huh? Ryan swallowed hard. Please, Lena. Just give me a chance. A familiar voice cut through the air. I think you've wasted enough of those. Lena turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway, arms crossed. Ryan's jaw tightened. And who the hell are you? Someone who actually shows up, Ethan said, his tone even. For a moment, no one moved. Then Lena spoke, her voice steady. You should leave, Ryan. Ryan's face fell. Lena. No, she cut him off. I'm not doing this. My son deserves more than someone who only wants to be a father when it's convenient. Ryan exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. He nodded once, reluctantly, then turned and walked out. As the door shut behind him, Lena let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Ethan stepped closer. You okay? She nodded. Yeah. Just tired of the past knocking on my door. Ethan studied her for a moment before speaking. Then maybe it's time to stop answering. Lena let out a breathless laugh. Maybe you're right. And for the first time in a long time, she meant it. The months passed quickly. Lena gave birth to a baby boy, a beautiful, perfect baby with dark hair and big, curious eyes. She named him Jack Carter. Her parents were there, tentative but trying. They held Jack with careful hands, learning how to love him in ways they had failed to love her. And Ethan? Ethan never left. He was there through it all. The sleepless nights, the moments of doubt, the milestones that made it all worth it. And somewhere along the way, the line between partnership and something more blurred. One evening, long after the diner had closed and Jack had finally fallen asleep, Lena found herself standing beside Ethan in the quiet kitchen, watching him sip his coffee like he always did. She hesitated for only a second before speaking. "You asked me once what I would tell my son to do," she murmured. Ethan turned to her, brow raised. "Yeah?" She swallowed, her heart pounding. "I'd tell him to stop being afraid of happiness." Ethan's lips twitched. "Smart kid." Lena took a deep breath, then stepped forward, closing the space between them. "I think it's time I take my own advice." And as Ethan set his coffee down and pulled her closer, Lena knew, this time, love wasn't something that left. It was something that stayed. Something that chose to stay. And that made all the difference. Lena's story isn't just about loss or betrayal, it's about strength, resilience, and the power to rebuild after everything falls apart. Sometimes, family isn't defined by blood but by those who choose to stay, no matter how tough life gets. She learned that not everyone who returns deserves forgiveness, but not everyone deserves to be shut out forever either. Most importantly, she realized that the past doesn't define her, the future is hers to choose. What do you think about this story? If you loved Lena's journey, comment 2. If you think she should have had a different ending, comment 7. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss more powerful stories like this one. Thank you for being here.